Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, please share the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast with a friend, with a fellow colleague, whoever you think would enjoy this wonderful program. We always appreciate that. And make sure that you've given us a rating and review. That's so helpful for spreading the show, everybody. Today's episode, I am so excited about. I've been working on this episode for a long time. It's an overview of the herbicide glyphosate. Maybe you've heard of the brand name Roundup. It's a really hot topic right now, and you may have heard of some of the controversies surrounding glyphosate. It's been all over the news, it being used heavily on food crops, glyphosate showing up in tests done on things like cereal and a wide variety of food products, actually, and then even eventual lawsuits linking the use of glyphosate to cancer. So it recently popped up on my radar because of an article that I was sent about glyphosate and coffee. So I'm going to share that with you today, and then I'm also going to have two professional guests on to really dig into what glyphosate is to help you listeners understand the subject, as well as the science behind herbicide use in general, and a bunch of natural farming topics. It's going to be a powerful and enlightening show. And then I want to round it out talking about the future of weed control practices and natural alternative weed control practices, and if these herbicides are really necessary here in late 2019 going into 2020 right now. And that's a real question you can ask, as you're about to find out. But first, let's begin with this coffee article that really caught my attention. It was published by CNN Business, and it's titled, "Nestle Tightens Controls on Coffee Beans After Weed Killer Scare." So let me read you a few excerpts here. This is from the article. Nestle will tighten quality controls on the coffee beans it buys after tests flagged levels of the controversial weed killer glyphosate that were close to regulatory limits. The world's largest coffee company said in a statement Friday, this is from last month, that it had found glyphosate residues close to the maximum allowed in some deliveries of green coffee beans. Glyphosate is the key ingredient in Monsanto's weed killer Roundup. In the United States, juries have awarded huge monetary damages to people who say their cancer was caused by glyphosate exposure. Bayer, which owns Monsanto, says the herbicide is safe when used properly. Nestle was quoted as saying, quote, "Our agronomists will continue to work with the coffee farmers to help them improve their weed management practices, including the appropriate use of herbicides and adoption of other weeding methods," end quote. The article goes on to say that earlier this year, a jury ordered Bayer to pay a California couple $2 billion in damages after the jury found that their cancer was caused by extensive glyphosate exposure. Really interesting stuff, and I just want to go over the end of the article here where they talk about the World Health Organization. Quote, "A 2015 study by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer found that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic to humans based on limited evidence of cancer in humans and based on sufficient evidence of cancer in experimental animals. However, later, a joint panel of the WHO and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization later concluded that glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic risk to humans from exposure through diet." So there's a lot of forces at work here, probably a lot of interests at play, I'd imagine, and it's a really, really complex subject. Immediately after reading this article, my interest was piqued, though, and I knew that I had to get a couple of guests on to talk about all the different sides of this issue. So I've rounded up two incredible guests, pardon the pun there. First is analytical scientist and quality control chemist Roscoe Wallace. He's going to join us on the line. He's going to talk about what glyphosate actually is, how it's manufactured, and how it functions in agricultural systems. And then we're going to wrap the show up by having a natural farming specialist and soil scientist on, Joshua Rutherford, and he's going to talk about the many ways to control and utilize weeds without reaching for those harmful herbicides unless absolutely necessary. And he's also going to talk about what he thinks the future looks like for weed control in large-scale farming. I'm so excited for this episode, you guys. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We're going to do this deep exploration to help you educate yourselves and form your own opinions and really understand this subject. And then we're also going to keep you up to date on the coffee side of this as well as things develop. So all right, guys, without further ado, let's jump into our first interview segment with analytical chemist Roscoe Wallace. And for this segment of the show, we have Roscoe Wallace on the line to talk about glyphosate, what it is made of, how it's made up, what it does, and all sorts of things. How you doing, Roscoe?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent, man. Great to have you back on the show. A classic guest for the classic episodes, chemical analyst Roscoe Wallace, going to talk about glyphosate today. Now, Roscoe, you may or may not have heard of this glyphosate coffee scandal. You know, glyphosate has been hitting the news for a couple different reasons, and most recently it was Nestle stepping up their testing for glyphosate in their coffee. So very interesting, and that's how it kind of comes into my world. Now, Roscoe, you've been reading a little bit about glyphosate, have you not?
Yeah, I have read up on it a little bit. That's interesting.
Yeah, let's talk about it, man. Tell me about the chemical makeup of glyphosate, what exactly the compound is.
So let me get a little general, and then I'll kind of dive in. How about that?
Certainly, perfect.
Glyphosate, trade name, Roundup. Monsanto brought it to market in 1974. It's a broad-spectrum systemic herbicide. So it goes for everything pretty much. And it's one of the most widely used.
And systemic, for the audience, systemic meaning if you hit just a leaf, it's not going to kill just that leaf. It's going to get within the system and kill the entire plant, theoretically, right?
You got it.
Okay, continue.
It's used to kill weeds that compete with crops, specifically grasses and herbaceous flowering plants. And it's an analog of the amino acid glycine. That's where the name comes from. They react glycine with phosphonic acid, I believe, and then they kind of just contract that name into glyphosate.
Interesting. So that's where it's kind of rooted in. Okay.
Yes. There are some toxic impurities that result from this reaction. You have formaldehyde to a certain percentage in the product, and there is this other compound, N-nitroso glyphosate, and that's a precursor to a genotoxic carcinogen. So that's a real nasty compound, and maybe it's there at a very low concentration, but that could be more harmful, in fact, than the glyphosate itself.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so by creating this product, there are also some even more, let's say, potentially harmful to humans compounds in there that are a result of the reaction?
Yes. It seems like, let me jump around a little with the testing. People say that the glyphosate alone is not so poisonous. It doesn't cause cancer, but when you test the formulations, maybe the surfactants that they use to dissolve the glyphosate in their solution, that might actually be that might be the root of the more nasty effects from that compound.
That is really interesting. And it was interesting what you said about a broad spectrum systemic herbicide, because broad spectrum systemic is about as intense as you can get. And I guess thinking back, the Roundup commercials, they always were kind of spraying it on your driveway, right? Like in the cracks of your lawn. But people are using this in an agricultural application, right?
Oh yeah, just everywhere. They're using it in the forest too, actually. I was reading, actually, you're talking about spraying on the driveway. That's probably the worst for runoff. A lot of that stuff that's sprayed on a hard surface just gets washed off by rainwater or something like that.
Right into the waterways?
Yeah, and that seems to have, the research points to at least Roundup having a bad effect on aquatic ecosystems.
Right.
So I don't think it's the glyphosate itself, but, the surfactants, impurities maybe, but probably that.
Let's talk about that runoff for a second and just kind of how glyphosate behaves in conjunction with ag practices, like how stable it is, what's showing up in testing, how the runoff behaves, how it affects microbiology in the rhizosphere, just anything you find interesting about how it acts in an agricultural setup.
Of course. So, you spray it on your field, all right? Glyphosate itself absorbs strongly to soil particles. So it kind of locks into the dirt in a field. And that's similar to phosphate fertilizers. So say you've used a lot of a phosphate fertilizer and then you use the glyphosate. Well, there's already something locked into that soil, so it doesn't have a spot to lock in. So it might
fascinating.
Run off a little.
And that's brutal because we've been overloading our soil with extra phosphorus for yields instead of tending to the microbial biology. So this is probably especially dangerous and especially quick to run off in synthetic big ag practices, I'd imagine, right? Because of exactly what you just said.
Makes sense to me.
Wow.
So glyphosate gets locked into the dirt. it's degraded by soil microbes to aminomethylphosphonic acid. Let's call it AMPA, and that's also locked into the dirt, so that stays there too. It doesn't wash out into groundwater or anything. Erosion can cause it to contaminate aquatic environments. So say you got a heavy rain, it's locked into that dirt, but that dirt could get pushed into a waterway, and then that's where the glyphosate ends up.
That is really fascinating. And I'll say again, I just saw some really interesting tests on tending to microbial biology in soil and runoff. And soil that has high microbiology doesn't have the same amount of runoff and erosion. I literally saw a visual test, and the soil holds better as well. So I think that this is all kind of compounding. But go ahead.
That's interesting. The half-life varies significantly depending where you're at. And there was a test in Texas, and glyphosate degraded in 3 days. But in like Idaho or somewhere farther north, it was half a year.
Oh, really?
And the half-life in water can vary from a few to almost 100 days as well. So,
oh wow,
very significantly based on the environmental conditions, how quickly that degrades.
That's fascinating. I wonder what's the big factor there. That's interesting.
Well, you'd think like Texas, more of a dry, very hot environment.
Yeah, maybe it would be more sensitive to the heat, cooking it off, so to speak. I'm not sure.
Get those microbes working faster.
That could also be
that
could also be the case. Yeah, interesting. Does it surprise you that this is showing up? There was the big cereal scandal. There now this coffee testing. After reading what you've read about what glyphosate is, does it surprise you that it's starting to show up in tests?
Well, it's good that we're being more concerned about the pesticides and the herbicides and how that actually impacts the food product.
100%.
Instead of just making it and forgetting about that fact. It makes sense that it's showing up. I'm glad that it's an issue.
Right.
You were talking about finding glyphosate in cereals, and I found out that they use it as a crop desiccant. Towards the end of harvest, they'll just spray it all over the plant, or they'll spray it on the plant to kill it, like they'll spray it on wheat, and that helps it evenly dry at the end of the season. So it aids northern farmers to kind of, it makes it easier to work with a shorter season. So yeah, it's used for more than just killing your weeds. I found that a very interesting thing. Also, if you spray it on sugarcane at the right time towards the end of the season, you get a little more sucrose than if you didn't use glyphosate.
Wow.
You're like killing the plant, and so maybe it's concentrating sugars in its final moments or something like that.
Different expressions out of emergency, different genetic expressions. Sure.
Yeah. So it's a versatile chemical. I found that really interesting.
Jeez, man. Yeah, that is interesting.
It does have antimicrobial activity, and it can the synergistic bacteria associated with soybean roots. It can inhibit their nitrogen fixation. So,
interesting.
That's been measured to a certain degree.
Man, it sounds like glyphosate can really mess some stuff up pretty bad. And what do you think about herbicide usage? You're a gardener yourself, and you've kind of perused big ag and studied big ag a little bit. What do you think about herbicide usage as a standard practice? And are you surprised that we haven't, found, let's say on a large scale, in a ubiquitous sense, eliminated these nasty herbicides? When there's other products out there, there's better natural farming methods. What do you think about that?
Think of trying to implement that practice across the giant industrial farming sector. That's to have a sustainable, no chemical input farm. That's a revolution. That's a huge green revolution, right?
That's a tall order.
I wish that we could get there. For glyphosate in particular, I think that it's probably better than herbicides they were using in the past.
Oh, interesting.
But I don't use herbicides on my yard. I'm uncomfortable about having that around my dog.
100%.
I don't like those chemical inputs in my life, but I see how those massive structures in society have come to rely on these chemical inputs, and it's going to take something big to get them off that.
True.
But what kind of grassroots organization is going to take over the conventional agriculture industries?
Mm-hmm. Man, you're setting us up for the second part of this episode like you have no idea, Roscoe. I appreciate that, man.
Nice.
I love it. I love it, man. Well, this was great. How about some final thoughts here? Anything about glyphosate before we wrap up? Maybe something you found interesting or just something you want to say to the listeners?
Very important thing, of course. Herbicide-resistant weeds have appeared. We've used glyphosate so much that we've created other plants we didn't want in the first place that are now stronger against our control techniques. Our insistent use of these chemicals is weakening our agricultural abilities. I would prefer agriculture that is less dependent on constant chemical inputs, as is often the case with conventional ag. And, apply it on an as-needed basis, not preventatively all the time.
Or as part of your harvesting cycle. That sounds a little bit dubious to me, man.
Oh, definitely.
Listen, Roscoe, this was great. This was a really even-handed and enlightening approach to this topic, man. So I appreciate you putting in the time to do this. You're in the lab. You're a chemical analyst by trade, so you didn't have to do this, and you did. So I appreciate it, man.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Okay, there you have it, everybody. Chemical analyst Roscoe Wallace. Very enlightening. So much good information that he left us with there. Now it's time to move on to the other side of this, the natural alternative side. Talk about what else we can be doing here. And I am so excited to get to the next guest, Joshua Rutherford. He's a soil scientist. Well, he's going to introduce himself, and you're going to hear all about his credentials. So let's just jump right in, everybody. He's a Korean natural farming expert. He's a weed control expert. He's a regenerative soil scientist. Please welcome, audience, Joshua Rutherford on the show. How you doing, Joshua?
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah,
really
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm really excited to get your take on this because we've spoken before, and your knowledge of soil science and all things weed control is astounding. So listen, Joshua, maybe we'll give a really brief background on your credentials and how you got into the field of regenerative soil science and then eventually Korean natural farming and natural weed control practices.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, glyphosate or the brand name Roundup definitely played a part in bringing my understanding into the living soil world and into the concept of growing things with life rather than killing things. So the concept in traditional commercial ag, as it's evolved, using chemical fertilizers, usually salt-based or oil-based, is that you give plants these things and then you kill everything else so that nothing else can attack it. You kill the weeds around it, you kill the bugs around it, and they kind of joke actually. The farmer wakes up on a Monday, it's like, what am I going to kill this week?
Right.
Versus natural farming is what am I going to promote? What am I going to make live? And once you get that paradigm shift, everything else makes sense. So weeds cease to be weeds, and they can become tools.
Mm-hmm.
And even it's a broad discussion, but even in as you transition your property, from a commercial or a chemical fertilizer program or a place where you've used Roundup, because what happens is when you use a chemical fertilizer or you use Roundup, it kills everything, right? Mm-hmm. So it kills all the good bugs and all the bad bugs. And most people are, in society are aware of probiotics or the idea of beneficial microorganisms.
Right.
We've taken antibiotics in our healthcare, and it kills everything. Same thing, right? And now people are learning that, you got to take probiotics to put the good stuff back in, because otherwise you're just, you're in a sterile environment. You're open to attack from good or bad.
I'm so glad that you drew that conclusion, because that is literally the border that this podcast straddles. We talk so much about the soil food web and microbial life, and then we also talk on the health side about the human microbiome. We had microbiome specialist Dr. Marvin Singh on, and we're going to have him back on again, and he just totally blew my mind about the importance of the diversity and health of the human microbiome. That is a one-to-one comparison, in my opinion, when it comes to its effect on longevity and just overall health and wellness and vigorousness and genetic expression and all the things that we're looking for, both in health and in agriculture. That's a one-to-one comparison, is it not?
Yeah, it goes deep, and we're just now getting to the point, technology-wise, where we're able to quantify these things. And the most, common sense thing, we have in our minds, we have the picture of a farm, right? The classic picture is a farm has many, many things. It has chickens, cows, maybe even horses. It has vegetables. It has fields, it has all these diverse things. And that's not the reality of what our farms are. The farms that feed us. We have chicken farms.
Totally.
And then we have pork farms, and then we have wheat farms. And so as certain folks have become enlightened, kind of the permaculture movement, the living soil movement, natural farming, we've moved away, like I was saying, from these killing systems to these life systems. But because we don't have a diverse animal culture in our food farms, our vegetable farms, and we don't have the mixed biome, that our plants aren't getting that biome, and they aren't getting the mineralization of the nutrients, right? So the animals are able to digest the plants, mineralize the nutrients, make it plant available when it hits the ground, and it is a whole level of actual nutrients that we're missing because we don't have the animals incorporated.
Totally.
And it's, if that makes sense. I kind of said that poorly, but
no, absolutely. You're talking about the full spectrum and the unforeseen consequences of these systems within a vacuum. And I think that the listeners, especially having listened to episodes with some of your peers on this show, like Chris Trump, for instance, I think we wrap our head around that when we talk about the liquid fertilizers killing the microbiology in the soil. That makes sense. The pesticides being a problem, but weed control specifically. First of all, I think a lot of people that are just kind of have a base knowledge of glyphosate think it's a pesticide. It's not a pesticide. It's an herbicide. It's to control weeds. This whole weed control side of it, I feel like, is less covered and less, I don't know, it's less sexy, I think. So let's shift our focus to that. Talk to me about this concept of using herbicides to kill weeds as opposed to, I assume, the many other methodologies that farmers can employ to not have this same problem.
Right. Well, I don't grow coffee yet. I have one little coffee plant. I aspire to grow coffee in an little greenhouse for myself.
We're going to cover all things coffee with coffee expert Ildi Revi, but I want to speak first with the weed control expert, the natural farming expert.
Yeah, well, in terms of like how you would grow coffee in a natural farming method, in a conventional way, I would imagine you'd have rows of coffee plants, and then you'd spray Roundup in between the rows to mitigate the weed control, right? And this is the problem that
sure,
it's getting overspray onto the plants and it kills all the bugs. So in a natural farming method, we wouldn't do that. You would let the whole thing go. And you might even, for instance, in my crops, I intentionally plant cover crops or living mulch crops is what we call them. And they're actually low growing perennial plants that will grow all year round. And then I can plant my plants in that area, and it'll grow up over it, and they'll still have the low growing mulch over
now,
it.
Now, how effective is that? Like, is that a surefire way to make sure you're never going to pick a weed? Is it, can you give that like a percentage of effectiveness?
It's pretty effective if you know how to plant seed and get a crop down. If you can get the living mulch down and get it started before the weeds come pop back up, it works really, really well. It's the same concept of cover crops. Where farmer will plant a crop, till it in, and then put another one in. And the other thing I want to speak about in terms of weeds, a weed is a plant that is not is in a place that you don't want it.
Right.
These, right. Like a lot of the weeds we see, common in North America are actually used in food, like microgreens, purslane, a lot of the microgreens I was growing. I started looking around and going, this is a weed. I'm just growing a small version of this weed and selling it to a chef for $50 a pound. This is crazy.
There's a quote, and it was by a famous writer. I want to say someone brilliant said it. It was Mark Twain or something. He said, "A weed is just a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered."
It's true. And so like in natural farming, there's many ways to use weeds. For instance, we deal with powdery mildew a lot, and it's a big concern for people. And so in a natural farm, in my farm here, I look around and I have powdery mildew on my melon plants, and I see, there's a plant, borage or whatever, that has no powdery mildew on it, a weed or whatever. And I can use it. I can actually take that, harvest that plant, ferment it, and reapply it to the plants that I'm growing, my target crop. And it'll have those properties, those resistant properties in it. The other thing I want to mention too is there's a progression, right? So if we took an old growth forest and we clear cut the thing, we'd be basically starting kind of at ground zero, at desertification, right? And if we just let that thing grow and no one touched it, and it would slowly evolve. First, the weeds would come up. It would be the first thing, the broadleafed weeds, and then slowly the grasses would come up, and then you'd see some shrubs come up. And then some softwoods would start to rise, and then the hardwoods would start to rise, and then the pines would come up, and eventually you turn into old growth. And what's going on in the soil zone is you're actually going from a fungally dominant soil, which is in an old growth. They're growing up lots of fungus in those woods, to a totally bacterial dominant soil. So if you have a lot of weeds, in your garden patch, 100% your soil is bacterial dominant, and so you need to transition it more to a 50-50 ratio for most vegetable crops, where it'd probably be 60-30, 70-30 in coffee, right? It'd be more fungally dominant. So as you spray the Roundup on the ground, you kill all the fungi because in the process, just the same, right? You start with bacteria. And the fungi takes so long to grow, right? So when you spray the Roundup on the soil, you kill all the organisms. And the first organisms to come back are the bacteria. They're the base level organisms. And it takes a lot longer for the fungi to develop. So you have to wait for that to happen.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Or you have to encourage it through all these different composting, natural farming, IMO techniques. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And we're going to get into some of those specifics, but this begs more questions. So first, my question is, if you can effectively control weeds with some cover crops and some fungally dominant soil, is that a practice that you can kind of ubiquitously apply to most or all systems? Like for instance, is this good in some crops but not others? Or in your estimation, can this be used basically everywhere on most crops in most agricultural systems?
Yes, the latter, everywhere. And it's basically, that's why I mentioned the progression. You find where your crop is in that progression, right? And you mimic that soil zone.
Let me ask you this: is weed control? It just seems like the argument you put forth is that weed control is just kind of unnecessary, like the chemical herbicidal weed control. Is there any good reason why we're still doing this? You know what I'm asking?
No, there isn't. I can't for the life of me.
It's wild. It's so wild.
It's really wild. We just,
That's wild, man. So this is just a lack of knowledge, and that's why I love hearing people share this podcast and other resources like it. Because if we can just make it a hot topic, right? Get it trendy. That's how this change really happens at a rapid pace, and possibly the fastest version of change, right? I don't think that the powers that be, the federal guidelines for agriculture, are going to change very quickly. But if we can kind of change the trends on the ground level, and especially if we can incentivize people, that's what Chris Trump was saying. That's the fastest way to get farmers to change, is to actually incentivize them monetarily and in other ways. That's how we get this change done fast, right?
Right, and that's kind of how we got to where we are. Like coffee, for example, is grown in areas where they're not putting a lot of money into their crops because they don't have a lot of money, right?
Right.
And it probably wasn't until recently that the fertilizers and Roundup even started getting applied, and it's a very easy result. When you throw a chemical fertilizer on an organic system, you throw it down, you see results.
Yeah, there's a big bumper crop from what I understand. That first change
boom.
point is going to be big. Yeah, boom.
Boom, and but then you don't realize the consequences.
Wow.
You're basically you're putting yourself, now you're addicted to your soil is addicted to the fertilizer and it needs it.
I've never heard that analogy before. That's interesting. Yeah. And that's what Chris Trump said, is we're teaching a lot of nations, unfortunately, to get kind of hooked on our version, but I think it's changing. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about Korean natural farming for those who have not heard of Korean natural farming. Can you give an overview of how people are using these weeds beneficially for their farms?
Yeah. So Korean natural farming is, taking all in the context of everything we just talked about, trying to bring the land back to health. And so the very basic basis of it is going into the woods, into old growth forest, the most untouched area you can find that is just vibrant and full of diverse life, and collecting microorganisms, bringing them back to your farm and growing them out, and then reapplying them over your farm so that they will grow out and literally change the soil. Mm-hmm. That's the basis of the whole program. And then from there, we use a lot of ferments, like I was talking about, fermenting different weeds to pull up different nutrients, like for comfrey is one that pops up everywhere, and it goes really deep down, and they call it a dynamic accumulator. It pulls up lots of minerals and nutrients in it. So we cut that and we take it and we ferment it, and then we can spray, put it into a spray and apply it foliarly to the plants, and they can uptake those nutrients really quickly.
So it's free nutrients basically that we're frying with these glyphosates if we're in the old system.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you have to have a little bit of equipment like anything else, to ferment. You have vessels, and we use sugar to ferment. So you need a little bit, but
geez, that's wild. Just sugar and an input is how you create this stuff.
Sugar is really all you need. Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. We buy some vinegar, things like that. And alcohol, we use alcohol also to extract nutrients from like turmeric and ginger, licorice, things like that.
Man, so you just gave a really kind of damning overview of our use of herbicides, which is there are other ways to control weeds that are very effective and actually can benefit your farm, your overall agriculture product in other ways. And even if you do have weeds, if you're killing them, you're basically wasting money and nutrients is money. That's the old saying.
Right. In a coffee example, so say you stop with Roundup. I'm going to discontinue using Roundup, and I'm going to plant a cover crop, a living mulch, in between my rows of coffee. Well, now I got to mow that thing. Well, why not just get some animals, and after you're done harvesting your coffee, you run the animals through there, and they fertilize for the next coffee crop. They eat the mulch, and you get a second crop out of the animals, right?
That's such a good point. There's a reason why farm systems were, fully enclosed systems, usually sustainable down to the fertilizers, the food that's provided by the different livestock. Like you said, a goat is just a lawnmower that you can milk.
Right.
I know I'm full of old adages that you're all very familiar with. But put that on my tombstone, please. That is definitely the quote that's the quote of the year for the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. We will shoot for 2020 a different quote, but there's the quote of the year. A goat is just a lawnmower you can milk. This was a fantastic overview, Joshua. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, man. Any final words about natural farming? Any advice you have to the home gardeners out there, or just anyone listening?
Well, you've already plugged Chris a couple times, but I would say he has such a great platform for teaching folks this on YouTube and his website. It's Natural Farming Co.
So cool.
And on his website, go to YouTube Chris Trump, and he explains all these practices in detail. And so that's where I would say is the beginning of the rabbit hole.
Wonderful. And then tell us about your upcoming soil science conferences.
Yeah, so it's the Science of Organic Regenerative Cannabis Cultivation Conference, and it's a really long-winded name.
That is a mouthful.
Because it's just to let people know right up front that this is a very specific event for very specific people who want to go really deep into the living soil systems. And so, I give in a broad overview, and what we do is we bring in experts. I mentioned Elaine Ingham. She pretty much wrote the book on soil food web. We bring in Chris Trump. He is, next to Master Cho, he's kind of the most advanced Korean natural farmer, and he's definitely a wonderful educator. We have Suzanne Wainwright Evans, the bug lady. She is an entomologist and a beneficial bug specialist. And so we have all these experts that come in, and we go really deep into how to use these systems and how to, operate them.
Love it.
It's been very, very meaningful.
Love it. Okay, everyone, that wraps up our interview with Joshua Rutherford, and that also wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in today and exploring glyphosate with me. Thank you for having the curiosity to sit and learn from today's experts, Joshua Rutherford and Roscoe Wallace. I hope you found today's episode to be extraordinarily enlightening. I know I did. And I look forward to exploring this subject and more with you in the future on the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Have an extraordinary day, everybody. Bye-bye.